Hey, okay, lesson one. We're going to start off with something a little bit difficult. And I normally don't like to do that, but I think this is really, really important as a foundational principle for game design. We're going to talk about objectivity in design. There's a lot of arguments that go all across everywhere, mostly the internet, where people talk about whether games are fundamentally subjective or objective. And you hear a lot from critics that games are objective, that art is objective, that things can be objectively good or bad. And a lot of the counter arguments are, well, if you enjoy it, and the point of a game in particular is to be enjoyable, then isn't the criteria whether or not it was enjoyable? And that comes down to the individual person, right? Well, yes, but also no. I think that basic argument on both sides is coming at it from a fundamentally useless point of view. The question itself is just not very effective because we're asking things like, well, can a game be objectively good? But the question, can it be objectively good, is not terribly specific. And in fact, I think if you're asking that question, the answer must necessarily be no, because you're asking if it's objectively good. Well, what does objectively good mean? See, the nice thing about subjectivity is you don't necessarily have to define good because it just comes down to, did you like it? But with objectivity, you have a little bit more work to do. You can't just say, well, it's objectively good, and then here's a bunch of things that I noticed. Because what makes these things good or bad is the point of that argument, and those arguments almost never include that. But there's an easy way around this. Just don't ask that question. You can ask a different question. Objectivity and subjective don't have to be thrown out as concepts. In fact, they're still very useful. But here is a little phrase that I like to use that I think sums it up really nicely. Subjectivity is the... what would you call it? Subjectivity is the luxury of a player. If you're a player, you have the luxury of subjectively determining whether or not the game was enjoyable to you. And that's all you need. And you're pretty much done once you've done that. There's no more additional analysis that's really required because your only goal was to enjoy the game, and you did on a personal, individual level. Done. But objectivity is the responsibility, the burden on the designer. Because as a designer, you no longer have the luxury of subjectivity because you're not making a game for yourself. You're making a game for many, many people or something. One possible way to approach that is to say, okay, well, what is objective then? And start looking at demographics and applying other marketing tools of like, well, who are we making the game for? And who do we think will subjectively find the game enjoyable so that we can say objectively over a large population of people, over a large player base, we've succeeded in making it enjoyable to most people. But I'm trying to do game design irrespective of all of those other considerations. So we're not just removing game design from things like building, like programming. And we're not just removing game design from the moment-to-moment decisions of what do you make and how do you balance things. Those are design, but I'm trying to create a more holistic perspective that will sort of form as a foundational framework for you to think about design. So, to that end, we need to be thinking about what is objective. But if objective is the burden of the designer, then our task becomes not to determine whether or not objectivity is some fundamental element of design or of art. We need to find out, how do we make design objective? Because subjectivity is a default. It's the default state of when you look at a thing, you experience a thing, you have that experience, and then that creates some kind of thoughts and feelings about that experience, and that's your subjective perspective with regard to that experience. But as game designers, it's important that we are objective, which doesn't happen naturally. We have to make it happen. We have to impose the tools of structure and impose clear, concrete criteria so that objectivity can be allowed to exist within that process. So subjectivity is the luxury of the player, and objectivity is the burden that's placed on the designer. It's the responsibility of the designer. So, okay, let's move forward with that as a foundation. Objectivity is a tool. It's something that you apply, that you take and you put into something. It's not something that's just there that you have to find. You don't discover it. You invent it. You create it. You figure out how to make it so. So how do we do that? Well, the first step, then, is to create very clear criteria. For example, if you say that your criteria is, you have one of your criterion, and that criterion is, I want the game to be fun. The most common thing that people say all the time about games is it's supposed to be fun. Okay, fine. It's supposed to be fun. How can we objectively make that the case? Well, we can't, right? Fun is inherently subjective. So either we have to define fun to a painstaking degree to the point that we can turn it into something objective, or we simply shift the question. We simply say, okay, let's say the game isn't fun, and rather than the game being, specifically fun, the game is, well, we can start by breaking it down to just a little bit. Maybe it's scary. If it's a horror game, it should be scary, and we can work with that. Or maybe the game should be tense, and maybe the game should be whatever you want to do, whatever your game is. Whatever your game is. Maybe you should have a severe sense of satisfaction from overcoming insurmountable odds. Whatever it is. Stop using the word fun, because it's not helpful to you in your attempt to build objectively good design. And I use objectively good very loosely, almost ironically there. But you're not worried about whether or not it's fun or whether or not it's good, because those aren't useful to you. If you use those as your foundations, you're not going to get anywhere. And that's really the main point, is don't worry about whether it is or is not the correct way of looking at things, or whether it's true in some absolute sense. Just worry about whether or not it's useful. Is the game fun is not very useful to you as a designer, because it's the kind of thing that can only be evaluated on an individual level once the game is already completed. But as a game designer, you start with nothing. You don't get to start with the completed product. You start with absolutely nothing, and you have to make something out of that. So, you're trying to make something out of nothing. And the first question you ask is it fun? Well, there's no way of knowing if it's fun, not only because you have nothing, but also because maybe you find it fun, but maybe somebody else doesn't. So what do you do then? Now you're at some very awkward impasse, right? So just don't use that as a concept. Don't use it as a starting point, because it's not going to be very useful to you as a starting point. It's never going to lead you to the next step in the process. You don't have a clear forward momentum. You don't have a clear end goal. And that means at the first thing you have to do is determine what your end goal is. Now, this isn't necessarily the first thing that you're doing chronologically, because there's a lot of back and forth that happens between, here's a game idea, let's play with that and work it out a little bit, and then ask ourselves, what are we really trying to accomplish with that? What does it accomplish? What doesn't it accomplish? And then move back to your criteria to go, oh, okay, do we want that versus this? And eventually you'll get to the point where you're going, yeah, we're pretty happy with this set of criteria. And you're usually going to have 2 or 3 of those, maybe 4. But usually you're going to hover around 3. And those are called your pillars. Those are your experiential pillars, because that's what's going to prop up the rest of the game. It's going to form the basis of your product. Whatever you're building is going to be defined primarily by those pillars. And then those pillars need to be broken down further And then you start building systems and features that work within those criteria. So this is really important. This is the most important thing. It's one of the hardest things to do too, because really you're trying to create a strong creative vision that's pretty concrete out of nothing. You start with very abstract concepts and you break it down into these little itty bitty hyper specific points. That's super difficult. It's very, very difficult. Don't get discouraged if it doesn't work out for you immediately. It takes time, it takes practice. Game design is hard. It's actually very hard to do well. I think like writing is similar to game design and writing have something in common, which is that people have a tendency to think of them as something that pretty much anyone could do. You come up with an idea, you go with it, you just do what feels right, and then you're done. You're good to go. So much more difficult than that. It's so much more complicated, so much more technical to really understand exactly how to make everything work. And if you use this foundation of how do I make my design objective? Well, first I have to define criteria that will create the framework that I can use to decide whether or not I'm successfully accomplishing those things. Because you'll never know at any point in time, am I accomplishing the game being fun? Well, to you, maybe. Maybe not. But how do you know that that translates to anybody else? And how do you know that that fun is the kind of fun that you're looking for? It's at that point, you're basically working from nothing, and most of what you're doing is guesswork. You could potentially eventually stumble on something, absolutely. And if you use this process, you'll probably eventually start picking up enough of an intuition that it works mostly okay. And then you can go back to the whole, rapid prototyping, lots of iteration process. And generally you'll be okay because you'll make a lot of mistakes, but you'll course correct as you make a thing and realize that it doesn't work. But what I want to try to convey is the idea that there is a better way. There is a way to sit down and go, well, can I hone just this part of the game design skill? To be absolutely clear, I'm not against iteration in any way. I'm very on board with iterating as many times as you can and getting a lot of prototypes out, because you need something concrete to work with, and there's not much that's more concrete than an actual prototype, because that has everything in it and you can see just how it works. So it's all about creating these practical points of view that allow you to move forward in an effective way, step by step. That's all pretty high-level abstract stuff. So let me give you a couple examples. When you're building a game, one good example of a good core criteria would be deciding to what extent your game is competitive versus cooperative, or competitive versus casual. That's another dichotomy. That's another relationship that you can define your game with. And the way that you define your game is going to affect the product. So if you define your game on a scale between competitive and cooperative, that's going to create a different product than if you define your game on a scale of competitive to casual. And you could do both. But what we're doing with these core pillars is we're defining the three or so most important things. So is the fact that it's casual versus competitive an important consideration? Is the fact that it's competitive versus casual, or competitive versus cooperative? Which of those is the more important thing to think about? If you're doing a PvP game, well, it's just competitive. We don't really need to worry about that because, okay, if you look at a game like, I don't know, Overwatch, okay, then you're getting a little bit of both. There's cooperative elements and competitive elements, sure. If you're talking about a 1v1 game like StarCraft, it's all competitive. There's really no cooperation, not really working with the team at all. You just win. So, in a game like Overwatch, the competitive versus cooperative consideration might be really important. To what extent is it cooperative? To what extent is it competitive? Well, on a larger scale, it might be competitive because we're looking at teams beating teams, and we're looking at an individual player's win rate. Maybe if you're climbing ladder, right? Then it's competitive. But as a designer, you need to be thinking about how much cooperation is required to compete, or how much competition is required to cooperate. Now you can see how much cooperation is required to compete question applies very aptly to a game like Overwatch, because the better that you cooperate, the more that you work with your team and develop sound tactics and strategies that work cohesively, the more likely you are to succeed. So cooperation is an element that leads to being more competitive. And if you're competitive, then it behooves you to be more cooperative with your team. So there's an interplay between the competition and the cooperative elements. But the other question, how competitive do you have to be cooperative, doesn't really apply to Overwatch at all. That would probably be something more like you would have to overcome some kind of opponent in order to gain the ability to cooperate with somebody, right? Almost the opposite of what Overwatch is. So by asking that question, we're creating a different product than if we ask the other question. Which question we ask is really important. And the way that you can apply objectivity in game design to this is to just go, well, we're asking the question, how competitive do you have to be in order to cooperate? But that is not going to create a game like Overwatch. That's not going to create an Overwatch type game. It never will. It's not really factual yet, but it's a very strong hypothesis. It's falsifiable because we can look at competitive Overwatch and we can look at how the game plays, and we can say, well, if we define the question how much competition is required in order for you to be able to cooperate, then we have to say, well, what does that mean? And it means that the way that I framed it was that it means that you have to win at something before you're able to cooperate with regard to something else, which objectively does not describe Overwatch. That is an inaccurate description of the game. So when you're designing, you can just go backwards. You can go, here's the question I'm posing. What kind of game might that create? And that helps you start to solidify your vision, and you can start having conversations and discussions about what that game will look like, what it will be based on that description. And this is extraordinarily valuable because if you can get really good at it, you can eliminate a lot of the guesswork that would normally come in pure rapid prototyping. One of the pitfalls that I see students fall into a lot, and I've been teaching game design for about 3 years now, and I've seen a lot of students go through the programs, and one of the big pitfalls that they run into is they just don't know how to get started. And granted, it's very difficult. It's very complicated, and it's very difficult to really build a strong vision and then move toward it. However, what they shouldn't do, I think, is they shouldn't just start building stuff. I think it's better to sit down and struggle through the thought process for a while, even though in an actual development environment, sitting down and spending a couple weeks struggling through just basic vision stuff is extraordinarily inefficient, and you should never do that. But for educational purposes, I think it makes perfect sense to sit down and try to figure that out. Because if you can get really good at it, it'll get faster and faster and faster to the point that you can do it like that. And you come up with a clear vision, you prototype something, and you know exactly how it doesn't quite work. Now, nothing ever quite works out that cleanly when you're actually in the process. But knowing how the process should look in an ideal circumstance really helps give you an idea of what you can be driving toward and what you can be figuring out and how to be looking at things in a way that's useful to you. This also applies to games that already exist. So when we're talking about gameplay analysis of a game that is already built, that maybe you're playing, you can worry about connecting player behaviors and player experiences to systems and features. And again, like before, where the idea was, well, you came up with an interesting hypothesis, and the hypothesis is a pretty good one because you can define all your terms and make a pretty clearly falsifiable hypothesis, and then test it. And that's what prototyping is really useful for, is in testing those hypotheses. When you're looking at a game that's already completed, you can just start connecting things and make hypotheses there too. So, well, a good example of that is if you watch people play the game a lot. You play the game, and then you watch a lot of people play the game. You can start to see behavior patterns unfold. And you go, well, it's interesting that all players seem to do this or feel this way at this point in the game. And then you just ask yourself, why might that be occurring? What in this system? Because if it's consistently happening, it's probably reasonable to assume that there's something in this system, in the game itself, that's incentivizing, encouraging, or even forcing players to make those behaviors. Now, I would tend to drop the forcing players part of things because it's a little too easy, and you're removing a lot of the gameplay, because gameplay is fundamentally about interesting player decisions. And if you just have like, oh, all players go straight in this particular instance of the game because there are no other options. It's a straight hallway, you can't turn around, you can't go left, and you can't go right. You can only go straight, and therefore all players go straight. That's not interesting. You're not going to learn a lot from that as a designer. But what you can learn a lot from is looking at player decisions and going, here's a point where player decisions could go either way, but very frequently tend to go one way. Why might that be? And you can put together an argument for why that would be. Well, the game does this and this and this and teaches you in this way. And because the game teaches you in this way, the player learns to do that. And because they're successful with that and they're rewarded for doing that, it becomes the foundational way that they look at the game. So when they come to this decision, they default to the thing that has been successful for them so far. And you can even look at things like, how does the game communicate that decision? How does it create that branch, that decision branch? How does it make sure that the player is making that decision? And how does it make the player make one of them instead of the other? These are all very interesting questions, because that's what design is. That's really what design is. How do we make players make specific decisions? It's not about, and when I say that, I don't mean players have decision A, B, and C, but we as designers are going to make players always take decision C. That's not what it is. It's players have decision A, B, and C. Why are we making them have that decision? Why? Why are we making them decide between A, B, or C? What about that decision, about deciding what's most valuable to them, A, B, or C, is interesting? Because if you can't make that decision interesting, chances are your game isn't going to work out very well, because the game is all about those decisions. And by the way, you can build criteria for those decisions as well. And you can talk about how we want most players to go with option B, or you can add conditionals. If the player has done this thing, then we'd expect that they're mostly going to take decision B. If they've done that thing and they take decision A, here's what that says about the player experience. If they've done that thing and they take C, here's what that says about the player experience. If they haven't done that thing, but then they take option B, here's what that says about that player's experience. And those kinds of things can really start to flow out and be really useful. And there's a lot more to it than that. But mostly, I think the most important thing is that you're really careful about how you're approaching game design conceptually, how you're thinking about it, how you're applying intellect and reasoning to game design as a process, and whether or not the questions that you're asking are valuable to you as a designer. And that's really, really important, because if you ask, is the game fun? Yes. Why is the game fun? Here's the reasons the game is fun. That's not useful to you as a designer, because if you've asked whether or not the game is fun and you say yes and then just give reasons, the important thing is not that you have a list of reasons. The important thing is that you figured out how the reasons that you're given connect to the question being asked. And if you ask, is the game fun? Yes. Here's why. you don't really have a connection point between the reasons that you're giving and the question that you've asked. You've just sort of listed things you enjoyed, or that rather that you thought you enjoyed. And that's an important distinction too, but that's a conversation for another time. So hopefully this has been useful in getting you to start thinking about how you think about game design. I know that's a little strange, but it really is important to have good process and have a good intellectual approach to game design so that you can be effective at what you're trying to accomplish. Don't let anyone ever tell you something like, oh, you have this mechanic in your game? That's dumb. That doesn't work that way. That should never work that way. The player should always have more options. The gameplay should be more dynamic than that. Those kinds of criticisms often don't mean anything, and they come from that person's particular background and particular preferences. And you need to really be careful about being objective in how you design your game and how you set up the theory behind your game. And what that means basically is just make sure that you have those core criteria put down, that those pillars are going to really drive you forward, and that they're really clear and really useful. That's the key. Make sure that those pillars are really useful. And the only way to make them useful is to make sure that they allow for the application of objectivity. If your pillars don't allow for the creation of objectivity, for the application of objectivity in game design, your pillars probably need to be retooled or just worked through a little bit further until they're very concrete. So hopefully this has helped. And good luck in all of your future designs.